Victoria's hands were shaking as she sat on the piano bench. She could feel her heart beating so fast it felt like it might jump out of her chest. The leather seat was cold beneath her, and she realized her palms were sweating. She wiped them quickly on her gray uniform, hoping no one would notice how nervous she was. The room had gone completely quiet. All 12 guests were watching her, waiting to see what would happen. Some of them were still smiling, expecting to be entertained by what they thought would be a simple, amateur performance. Others looked genuinely curious, probably wondering why their host was putting his housekeeper in such an uncomfortable position. David stood right next to the piano, his expensive wine glass in one hand, that cruel smile still on his face. He was enjoying this moment way too much. Victoria could see it in his eyes. He thought he was about to humiliate her in front of all his wealthy friends. He probably expected her to play a few wrong notes, maybe stumble through a children's song, and then he could have a good laugh about it. "Well," David said, his voice breaking the silence. "We're all waiting. Don't tell me you're getting cold feet now." Victoria stared down at the black and white keys. They looked so familiar, like old friends she hadn't seen in years. Her fingers wanted to touch them, but her mind was screaming at her to be careful. She had worked so hard to keep her past hidden, to build this new life where nobody knew who she used to be. Playing this piano could destroy everything she had worked for, but she was trapped. If she refused to play, David would be angry, and angry David was dangerous. He could fire her on the spot, and then where would she go? She had no family to help her, no friends in this city, and barely any money saved up. This job was the only thing keeping her from being homeless. "I'm not sure I remember much," she said quietly, trying to buy herself some time. "It's been a very long time since I played anything." "Oh, don't worry about that," said the woman in the expensive dress. "We're not expecting a concert performance. Just play whatever comes to mind, something simple and sweet." "Yes," agreed the man with the silver hair, "maybe something we all know. Mary had a little lamb or chopsticks. We just want to hear." "What you can do," Victoria almost laughed at that. If only they knew what she could really do. If only they knew that she had once played in some of the most famous concert halls in the world, that critics had called her a genius, that she had been destined for greatness before everything fell apart. But they didn't know any of that. To them, she was just the housekeeper, someone who probably learned to play piano at a church or a community center, someone who might be able to stumble through a basic song if she was lucky. "Come on, Victoria," David said, and his voice was getting impatient. "We don't have all night. Just play something. Anything." Victoria looked up at him, and for a moment she felt a flash of anger. How dare he put her in this position? How dare he use her as entertainment for his guests? How dare he assume that she was just some simple woman who would be grateful for the chance to perform for his amusement? But then she looked around the room at all the faces watching her, and the anger faded into something else. These people had no idea who she really was. They thought they were about to witness something cute and harmless. They had no idea that they were about to see something that would change everything. Victoria closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She thought about her old life, about the years of training, about the hours she had spent practicing until her fingers bled. She thought about the concert halls, the standing ovations, the feeling of being completely alive when the music flowed through her. She thought about her teacher, Professor Williams, who had trained her since she was 7 years old. "Music is not just notes on a page," he used to say. "Music is the language of the soul. When you play, you're not just moving your fingers, you're telling the world who you really are." Victoria had spent the last 2 years trying to forget who she really was. But sitting at this piano, with these people watching her, she realized that she couldn't hide forever. The music was still inside her, waiting to come out. Her fingers found the keys, and she started with a single, soft note. Middle C, the sound filled the room, pure and clear. Then she played another note and another, building a simple melody that everyone would recognize. At first, it sounded like she might actually play something basic, just like they expected. The guests relaxed a little, smiling at each other as if to say, well, at least she can carry a tune. But then something changed. Victoria's fingers began to move faster, more confidently. The simple melody she had started with began to transform into something more complex, more beautiful. She wasn't playing Mary Had a Little Lamb or Chopsticks. She was playing something much more difficult. The guests stopped smiling and started paying attention. Really paying attention. The notes coming from the piano were not what they had expected at all. This wasn't amateur hour. This was something else entirely. David's smile began to fade. He had expected Victoria to embarrass herself, to prove that she was just a simple housekeeper who didn't belong in his world. But the music coming from his piano was nothing like what he had imagined. It was professional. It was beautiful. It was impossible. Victoria's eyes were still closed, and her fingers were dancing across the keys like they had a life of their own. The piece she had chosen was one of the most difficult in classical music, Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. It was a piece that only the most skilled pianists in the world could play properly. A piece that required years of training and natural talent, but Victoria wasn't just playing it. She was making it sing. The room was completely silent except for the music. The guests had stopped drinking their wine, stopped making small talk, stopped doing everything except listening. Some of them had their mouths open in shock. Others looked like they couldn't believe what they were hearing. The music filled every corner of the room, every space between the walls. It was powerful and emotional and perfect. Victoria's fingers moved with precision and grace, hitting every note exactly right, building the melody to heights that made everyone in the room hold their breath. This wasn't just good playing. This was extraordinary. This was the kind of performance that belonged in Carnegie Hall or Lincoln Center, not in someone's living room during a dinner party. This was world-class musicianship coming from someone they had all dismissed as just the help. David stood frozen next to the piano, his wine glass forgotten in his hand. His face had gone pale, and his mouth was slightly open. He looked like someone who had just seen a ghost, or maybe like someone who had just realized he had made a terrible mistake. The other guests were equally stunned. The woman in the expensive dress had tears in her eyes. The man with the silver hair was leaning forward in his chair, completely absorbed in the music. Nobody was talking. Nobody was moving. Everyone was just listening to the most beautiful music they had ever heard in their lives. Victoria kept playing, lost in the music, lost in the feeling of being herself again for the first time in 2 years. Her fingers remembered every note, every nuance, every emotion that this piece was meant to convey. She had performed this concerto dozens of times in her previous life, but tonight it felt different. Tonight it felt like she was playing for her life. As the piece built toward its climax, the room seemed to hold its breath, and then suddenly it was over. Victoria played the final notes, and then there was nothing but silence. The silence that followed was unlike anything Victoria had ever experienced. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of an empty room or the peaceful stillness of early morning. This was the kind of silence that felt heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. She kept her eyes closed, her hands still resting on the piano keys, afraid to look up and see the faces of the people around her. For what felt like forever, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody even seemed to breathe. The last notes of Rachmaninoff's concerto were still echoing in the air, but the silence was so complete that Victoria could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Finally, she opened her eyes and slowly turned around on the piano bench. What she saw made her stomach drop. Every single person in the room was staring at her with expressions she had never seen before. Their faces showed shock, confusion, and something that looked almost like fear. David was standing exactly where he had been when she started playing, but he looked like a completely different person. His smug smile was gone. His confident posture had disappeared. He was pale, his mouth slightly open, and his wine glass was tilting in his hand. A few drops of expensive red wine had spilled onto his perfect white shirt, but he didn't seem to notice. The woman in the expensive dress had tears streaming down her cheeks. She wasn't crying because she was sad, but because the music had moved her so deeply that her emotions had taken over. Her carefully applied makeup was smudged, but she didn't care. She was looking at Victoria like she had just witnessed a miracle. The man with the silver hair was leaning forward in his chair, his hands gripping the armrest so tightly that his knuckles were white. His eyes were wide with disbelief, and he kept shaking his head slightly, as if trying to convince himself that what he had just heard was real. Other guests were scattered around the room in various states of shock. Some were standing with their mouths open. Others had sunk into chairs, looking like they needed to sit down before they fell down. A few were whispering to each other in voices so quiet that Victoria couldn't hear what they were saying. But their faces showed the same amazement that everyone else displayed. Victoria felt her hands trembling again, but this time it wasn't from nervousness. It was from the realization of what she had just done. She had exposed herself completely. She had revealed the secret she had been hiding for 2 years. These people now knew that she wasn't just a housekeeper. They knew she was something else entirely, something that didn't match the story she had been telling about her life. The silence stretched on and on. Victoria started to panic, wondering if she should say something, if she should apologize, if she should run from the room. But before she could decide what to do, something unexpected happened. The man with the silver hair started to clap. It was slow at first, just a few deliberate claps that echoed through the quiet room. But then the woman with tears on her cheeks joined in, then another guest. Then another. Within seconds, the entire room erupted in applause. But this wasn't the polite clapping that people do at the end of a dinner party when someone makes a toast. This was thunderous, overwhelming applause that seemed to shake the walls of the mansion. People were standing up, clapping as hard as they could, some of them shouting, "Bravo!" and "Incredible!" Victoria sat frozen on the piano bench, completely overwhelmed by the response. She had expected embarrassment, maybe some awkward compliments, and then for everyone to move on with their evening. She had not expected this. She had not expected to see grown adults with tears in their eyes, applauding like they had just witnessed the performance of a lifetime. The applause went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. When it finally began to die down, the guests started talking all at once. Their voices overlapped, creating a buzz of excitement and confusion that filled the room. "That was absolutely incredible," said a woman Victoria had never seen before. "I've been to the Metropolitan Opera, I've been to Carnegie Hall, and I've never heard anything like that." "Where did you learn to play like that?" asked another guest. "That was professional level." "That was beyond professional level." "I can't believe what I just heard," said a man in a navy blue suit. "That was Rachmaninoff's Second Concerto, one of the most difficult pieces ever written. How in the world does a housekeeper know how to play that?" Victoria looked around at all the faces turned toward her, all the questions being thrown in her direction, and felt completely lost. She had no idea how to respond. She had spent 2 years perfecting the art of being invisible, of being forgettable, of being just another face in the crowd. Now, suddenly she was the center of attention in a way that terrified her. I used to play when I was younger," she said quietly, but her voice was so soft that most people couldn't hear her over the excited chatter. "Speak up, dear," said the woman with the smudged makeup. "We can't hear you." Victoria cleared her throat and tried again, a little louder this time. "I used to play piano when I was younger. I had some lessons." The man with the silver hair laughed, but it wasn't a mean laugh. It was the kind of laugh that comes from pure disbelief. "Some lessons?" he repeated. "My dear, what you just played takes years of intensive training. That's not some lessons. That's a lifetime of dedication." "Who was your teacher?" asked another guest. "Where did you study? What conservatory did you attend?" The questions kept coming, faster and faster, and Victoria felt like she was drowning in them. She looked desperately toward David, hoping he might rescue her from this situation. But he was still standing there in shock, apparently unable to process what had just happened. "Please," Victoria said, standing up from the piano bench. "I really should get back to work. I have dishes to clean and dishes," interrupted the woman with the tears. "You're worried about dishes after what you just did?" That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard in my life, and you want to go wash dishes? But that's my job, Victoria said, feeling more confused and frightened by the minute. I'm the housekeeper. I'm supposed to be working, not playing piano like a world-class musician. Finished the man in the navy suit. I think we're all a little confused about what your job actually is. Victoria felt trapped again, but this time it was different from before. Earlier she had felt trapped by David's demand that she play. Now she felt trapped by the aftermath of her decision to reveal her abilities. These people weren't going to let her just disappear back into the kitchen and pretend this hadn't happened. I think, said the man with the silver hair, that we all need to sit down and have a proper conversation. Because what just happened here is not normal. What you just did is not something that happens every day. He walked over to Victoria and looked at her with kind but serious eyes. My name is Robert Chun, and I've been involved in the classical music world for 30 years. I've heard the best pianists in the world perform. I've judged international competitions. I've discovered talent that has gone on to become famous around the globe. And what you just played was as good as anything I've ever heard. Victoria felt her heart skip a beat. Robert Chung, she knew that name. Anyone who had ever been serious about classical music knew that name. He was one of the most respected music critics and talent scouts in the country. He had discovered some of the biggest names in classical music, and he was standing in David's living room telling her that her playing was world class. I don't understand, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm just a housekeeper. I clean houses. I serve food. I'm nobody special, Robert shook his head. No, my dear. You are definitely somebody special. The question is, who exactly are you and how did you end up here? Victoria looked around the room at all the faces watching her, waiting for her answer. She saw curiosity, excitement, and genuine care in their expressions. But she also saw something that frightened her, recognition. These were wealthy, connected people who moved in the same circles as the classical music world. If any of them started asking questions, started digging into her past, they might discover the truth about who she really was and what had happened to her, and that truth was something she wasn't ready to share with anyone. After what felt like the longest evening of Victoria's life, the guests finally began to leave David's mansion. But they didn't leave quietly like they usually did after his dinner parties. Instead, they clustered around the front door, still, talking excitedly about what they had witnessed. Victoria could hear fragments of their conversations as she tried to clean up the dining room. I still can't believe what I heard tonight, one woman was saying to her husband as they put on their coats. We have to find out more about her, another guest whispered. Someone with that kind of talent doesn't just appear out of nowhere. Did you see David's face? Someone else laughed. I don't think he's recovered yet. Victoria kept her head down, collecting empty wine glasses and loading them onto her serving tray. Her hands were still shaking slightly, and she kept dropping things. Every time she heard her name mentioned, her stomach twisted with anxiety. She just wanted everyone to leave so she could disappear back into her small room and try to figure out what to do next. Robert Chun was one of the last guests to leave. Before he walked out the door, he approached Victoria, who was wiping down the dining room table. Miss, he said gently, I hope you'll think about what I said tonight. Someone with your abilities shouldn't be hiding in the shadows. The world needs to hear you play. He handed her a business card. When you're ready to talk, please call me. I mean that. Victoria took the card with trembling fingers but didn't look at it. She just nodded and mumbled a quiet, thank you, before Robert finally left with the other guests. When the front door closed behind the last guest, the mansion fell into an eerie quiet. Victoria continued cleaning, hoping that David would just go to bed and leave her alone. Maybe they could both pretend that tonight had never happened. Maybe tomorrow everything could go back to normal, but she knew that was impossible. Too much had changed. Too much had been revealed. Victoria was in the kitchen, washing the last of the dishes, when she heard David's footsteps approaching. She didn't look up, focusing intently on scrubbing a plate that was already clean. She could feel him standing in the doorway, watching her, but she pretended not to notice. Victoria, His voice cut through the silence like a knife. She kept washing. The same plate over and over. Yes, sir. Look at me. Slowly, reluctantly, Victoria turned around. David was standing in the kitchen doorway, still wearing his expensive suit, but he looked different than she had ever seen him before. His usual arrogant confidence was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like confusion and maybe even a little fear. "We need to talk," he said, walking into the kitchen and sitting down at the small breakfast table where Victoria usually ate her meals alone. "I really should finish cleaning up," Victoria said, turning back to the sink. "It's getting late, and I know you have an early meeting tomorrow." "The dishes can wait," David said firmly. "Sit down." Victoria dried her hands on a kitchen towel and reluctantly sat across from him at the table. She kept her eyes focused on her hands, folded in her lap, unable to meet his gaze. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The kitchen was quiet except for the soft humming of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a car driving past outside. Finally, David broke the silence. "Who are you?" Victoria looked up, startled. "I don't understand what you mean." "Yes, you do," David said, leaning forward across the table. "Don't play games with me, Victoria. What I heard tonight, that wasn't something you learned at a community center or from some local piano teacher. That was conservatory level playing. That was professional musician level playing. So I'll ask you again, who are you?" Victoria felt her heart racing. She had been dreading this conversation for the entire evening, but she still wasn't prepared for it. "I'm your housekeeper," she said quietly. "That's who I am." David laughed, but there was no humor in it. "My housekeeper?" "My housekeeper just played one of the most difficult pieces in classical music perfectly in front of some of the most well-connected people in this city. My housekeeper made Robert Chun cry." "Do you know who Robert Chun is?" Victoria nodded reluctantly. "Then, you know that he doesn't cry at dinner parties. He doesn't get emotional about music unless it's truly extraordinary. And tonight, he told me that you have more natural talent than most of the musicians he's worked with in his 30-year career." David stood up and began pacing around the small kitchen. "So let's try this again. Who are you really? Where did you come from? Why are you working as a housekeeper when you can play piano like that?" "I told you, I used to play when I was younger," Victoria said, sticking to her story even though she knew it sounded weak. "When you were younger," David repeated. "Victoria, you don't just lose that kind of skill. You don't just forget how to play like that. That level of ability takes years of intensive training, and it doesn't just disappear." He stopped pacing and looked directly at her. "I've been thinking about this all evening, and I keep coming back to the same questions. If you can play like that, why are you here? Why are you cleaning my house and serving my food? Why are you living in a tiny room and working for minimum wage when you could be performing in concert halls?" Victoria felt tears starting to form in her eyes, but she blinked them back. She couldn't cry. She couldn't show weakness. She had to protect herself and the new life she had built, even if it wasn't much of a life. "Maybe I just don't want that anymore," she said. "Maybe I'm happy with my life the way it is." David stared at her for a long moment, and she could see his sharp business mind working, trying to piece together the puzzle she represented. "No," he said finally. "No, that's not it. Nobody with your talent would choose this life unless they had to, unless they were running from something or hiding from something." Victoria's blood went cold. He was getting too close to the truth, asking the exact questions she had been afraid someone would ask. "I think you're overthinking this," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "People have hobbies. I used to play piano as a hobby, and I still remember some pieces. That's all." "A hobby?" David's voice rose with disbelief. "Victoria, what you played tonight wasn't a hobby. That was professional-level musicianship. That was the kind of playing that takes 12 hours of practice a day for years and years." He sat back down across from her, and his voice became quieter, but more intense. "I may be arrogant, and I may be difficult to work for, but I'm not stupid. I built a multi-million-dollar company by being able to read people, by being able to see through lies and half-truths. And everything about you tonight was telling me that there's a much bigger story here. Victoria felt trapped. David's eyes were boring into her, and she could see that he wasn't going to let this go. His business instincts were telling him that something didn't add up, and he was like a dog with a bone when he sensed a mystery. "What happened to you?" he asked more gently. "What made someone with your abilities end up working as a housekeeper?" "Because I'm starting to think that maybe you didn't choose this life. Maybe this life chose you." Victoria felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. For 2 years, she had managed to keep her secret safe. For 2 years, she had lived as just another invisible person trying to get by. But one moment of weakness, one moment where she had let her true self show through, and now everything was falling apart. "Please," she whispered, "can we just forget about tonight? Can we just go back to the way things were? I'll be more careful. I won't go near the piano again. I'll just do my job and stay out of your way." David shook his head. "It's too late for that, Victoria. Too many people saw what happened tonight. Robert Chen alone could make a few phone calls and have your story spread throughout the classical music world within a week. If you're hiding something, if you're running from something, it's going to come out whether you want it to or not." He leaned forward again, and for the first time since she had known him, his voice was kind instead of demanding. "Maybe it's time to stop running. Maybe it's time to tell someone the truth about who you really are." Victoria looked into his eyes and saw something she had never seen there before. Genuine concern. Not the fake politeness he showed his business partners, not the cruel amusement he usually directed at her, but real human concern for another person's well-being, and in that moment, she realized that her choice had been taken away from her. The life she had built on lies and half-truths was over. The only question now was whether she would tell her story herself, or whether she would let others discover it and tell it for her. Either way, Victoria Martinez was about to stop existing, and the person she used to be was about to come back from the dead. Victoria sat in the kitchen chair staring at her hands, knowing that her world was about to change forever. David was waiting for her to speak, and she could feel the weight of his expectations pressing down on her. She had kept her secret for 2 long years, but now it felt like trying to hold back an ocean with her bare hands. "My real name," she said quietly, "is Victoria Martinez. But that's not the name I used when I was performing." David leaned forward, listening carefully. He could sense that she was finally ready to tell the truth, and he didn't want to say anything that might make her change her mind. "When I was performing," Victoria continued, "I went by Victoria Moreau. It was my stage name, the name that appeared on concert programs and CD covers." She paused, waiting to see if David recognized it. His eyes widened slightly. "Victoria Moreau," he repeated slowly. "That name sounds familiar. I feel like I've heard it before, but I can't place where." "You probably have," Victoria said with a bitter smile. 3 years ago, I was one of the most promising young pianists in the world. I had a recording contract, a full schedule of performances, and critics were calling me the next great classical musician. I was supposed to be the future of piano music. She stood up from the table and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the dark night. It was easier to talk when she wasn't looking directly at David's face. "I started playing piano when I was 4 years old," she began, her voice taking on a distant quality as she remembered her childhood. "My mother worked 2 jobs to pay for my lessons, even though we could barely afford food sometimes. But she saw something in me, some kind of gift, and she was determined to help me develop it." Victoria closed her eyes, remembering those early days. By the time I was 8, I was winning local competitions. By 12, I was winning state competitions. And by 16, I was accepted into the most prestigious music school in the country on a full scholarship. "That's incredible," David said softly. "Your mother must have been so proud." "She was," Victoria replied, and for the first time, there was warmth in her voice. "She used to say that listening to me play was like hearing angels sing." She saved every newspaper article about me, every program from every performance. She had this scrapbook that was 3 inches thick with all my accomplishments, but then Victoria's expression darkened. She died in a car accident just before I graduated from music school. She never got to see me perform at Carnegie Hall. She never got to see me become successful. David felt a pang of sympathy. I'm sorry for your loss. Victoria nodded, but continued with her story. After I graduated, things happened very quickly. I got an agent, started performing with major orchestras, and signed a recording deal. My first album was called Rising Star, and it went to #1 on the classical music charts. I was 22 years old, and the world was telling me I could have anything I wanted. She turned back toward David, and he could see the pain in her eyes. For 2 years, it was like living in a dream. I performed in the most beautiful concert halls in the world. I worked with the greatest musicians of our time. I had fans who would travel hundreds of miles just to hear me play. I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. What happened? David asked, though he suspected the answer wouldn't be pleasant. Victoria sat back down at the table, and her voice became quieter, more careful. There was another pianist, someone who had been trying to make it in the classical world for years, without much success. His name was Jonathan Blake, and he was talented but not exceptional. He was the kind of musician who could play all the right notes but couldn't make people feel anything when he played. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Jonathan was jealous of my success. He felt like I had taken opportunities that should have been his, and he decided to do something about it. David could sense that they were getting to the heart of the story, the part that had destroyed Victoria's life and brought her to his kitchen. I had been working on a new composition, Victoria continued. It was going to be the centerpiece of my second album, something completely original that I had written myself. I was so excited about it, and I would practice it for hours every day in my apartment. She took a deep breath before continuing. What I didn't know was that Jonathan had somehow gotten into my apartment building. He had befriended the building. Manager claimed he was a friend of mine and gotten a key to my place. For weeks, he was coming into my apartment when I wasn't there and recording my practice sessions. David felt his stomach drop. He could see where this story was going. Jonathan took those recordings and did something terrible with them. Victoria said, her voice shaking with anger even after all this time. He had a friend who was good with computers, and they manipulated the recordings to make it sound like I was playing someone else's music instead of my own composition. They framed you for plagiarism, David said, understanding the scope of the betrayal. Worse than that, Victoria replied. They made it look like I had been stealing music from other composers for my entire career. Jonathan's friend created fake evidence, doctored audio files, and even planted sheet music in my apartment that made it look like I had been copying other people's work and claiming it as my own. Victoria's hands were clenched into fists on the table. The scandal broke 3 days before my biggest performance of the year. I was supposed to debut my new composition with the National Symphony Orchestra in front of critics and industry. Executives from around the world. What did you do? I tried to fight it, Victoria said. I tried to prove that the evidence was fake, that I had been set up. But Jonathan had been very clever. The fake evidence looked real, and he had been careful to make sure there were no traces leading back to him. She stood up again and started pacing around the small kitchen, just like David had done earlier. The worst part was that the music world turned on me immediately. Critics who had praised me just weeks before were writing articles about how I was a fraud. Venues canceled my performances. My recording company dropped me. Other musicians refused to work with me. What about your teacher, your friends, people who knew you? David asked. Victoria laughed bitterly. That was the cruelest part of all. Professor Williams, who had been like a father to me for 15 years, was forced to publicly distance himself from me. The music school where I had studied removed my name from their list of distinguished graduates. Even friends I had known for years stopped returning my phone calls. They all abandoned you? They had to, Victoria explained. The classical music world is very small and very political. If they had supported me, their own careers would have been destroyed. Professor Williams told me privately that he believed I was innocent, but he couldn't say that publicly without ruining his reputation and the reputation of his school. Victoria sat back down, looking exhausted from telling her story. Within 6 months, I had gone from being one of the most celebrated young musicians in the world to being completely unemployable. Nobody would hire me, nobody would work with me, and nobody would even listen to my side of the story. How did you survive? I sold everything I owned, Victoria said simply. My apartment, my furniture, my jewelry, even my piano. I took the money and moved to this city where nobody knew who I was. I changed my last name back to Martinez, which was my mother's maiden name, and I started over with nothing. David was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the full scope of what Victoria had been through. Why didn't you keep fighting? Why didn't you try to clear your name? I did try for a while, Victoria replied, but Jonathan had been too thorough. Every piece of evidence I found that proved my innocence was contradicted by 2 pieces of fake evidence that proved my guilt. And after a year of trying, I was broke, exhausted, and emotionally destroyed. She looked directly at David for the first time since she had started telling her story. So I gave up. I decided that Victoria Moreau was dead and that Victoria Martinez would live a quiet, simple life where nobody expected anything from her and nobody could hurt her. Until tonight, David said softly. Until tonight, Victoria agreed. Until you forced me to play that piano and reminded me of everything I used to be, everything I lost, and everything I'm still afraid of losing again? The kitchen fell silent. Again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence that comes after a storm, when the truth has finally been spoken and there's nothing left to hide. After Victoria finished telling her story, the kitchen fell into a heavy silence. David sat across from her, processing everything he had just heard. His mind was racing, trying to piece together all the details and understand the full scope of what had happened to her. Victoria watched his face carefully, trying to read his expression. She had just revealed her deepest secret, the truth she had been hiding for 2 years. Now she was completely vulnerable, waiting to see how he would react. Would he fire her? Would he expose her secret to his wealthy friends? Would he use this information against her somehow? David finally spoke, his voice quiet and thoughtful. Victoria, what happened to you was horrible. It was cruel and unfair, and you didn't deserve any of it. She blinked in surprise. Those were not the words she had expected to hear. But, David continued, I think you're making a mistake by hiding from who you really are. What do you mean? Victoria asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. David leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked at her as an equal rather than as his employee. What I mean is that Jonathan Blake? Juan. He destroyed your career, forced you into hiding, and made you give up the thing you love most in the world. And you're letting him keep winning by staying hidden. Victoria felt a flash of anger. You don't understand. I tried to fight back. I tried to clear my name. It didn't work. That was 3 years ago, David pointed out. You were young, you were alone, and you didn't have the right resources. Things are different now. How are they different? Victoria demanded. I'm still the woman who was accused of plagiarism. I'm still the musician who was banned from every major venue in the country. Nothing has changed. David smiled, and it wasn't his usual arrogant smile. This one was different. It was calculating, but in a way that seemed designed to help her rather than hurt her. Everything has changed, he said. You're not alone anymore. You have me, Victoria stared at him. I don't understand what you're trying to say. I'm saying that I want to help you, David explained. I want to help you clear your name and get your career back. Why? Victoria asked suspiciously. Why would you want to do that? What's in it for you? David was quiet for a moment, considering how to answer. Honestly? At first, it's because I feel guilty about how I've treated you. Tonight, I was planning to humiliate you for my own entertainment. I was going to make you play piano so my friends and I could laugh at your expense. That was cruel and wrong, and I owe you better than that. He paused, then continued. But beyond that, after hearing you play tonight, I realized something. You have a gift that's too precious to waste. What you can do with music is extraordinary, and the world deserves to hear it. Victoria shook her head. It's impossible. Too much time has passed. Too many people believe the lies about me. And Jonathan Blake is still out there, probably ready to destroy me again if I try to come back. That's where you're wrong, David said, his business instincts taking over. I've built my career on solving impossible problems. I've taken companies that were on the verge of bankruptcy and turned them into success stories. I've exposed frauds, uncovered conspiracies, and proven things that everyone said couldn't be proven. He stood up and started pacing again, his mind already working on the problem. The key is that we don't try to fight the old accusations directly. Instead, we create a new narrative that's so compelling, so undeniable, that it makes the old story irrelevant. I don't understand, Victoria said. Think about it, David explained. Tonight, 12 of the most influential people in this city heard you play. They saw your talent with their own eyes, with no warning, no preparation, no chance for trickery. Robert Chun, one of the most respected music critics in the country, was brought to tears by your performance. David sat back down and looked directly at Victoria. Those people are going to talk. They're going to tell their friends about what they witnessed. And when they do, they're going to create buzz and curiosity about who you really are. Victoria felt a chill of fear. That's exactly what I'm afraid of. If people start asking questions, if they start digging into my past, then we make sure they find the right answers, David interrupted. We control the narrative instead of letting other people control it for us. How? David's eyes lit up with the excitement of a new challenge. We hire the best private investigators money can buy. We find out exactly how Jonathan Blake framed you, and we expose every detail of his scheme. We track down every piece of fake evidence and prove it was manufactured. We find witnesses, we analyze the audio files, and we build an airtight case. That proves your innocence. Victoria's heart started beating faster. The idea was tempting, but also terrifying. And what if we can't prove it? What if Jonathan was too careful and there's no evidence left? Then we create doubt, David said. We don't need to prove beyond any shadow of doubt that you were framed. We just need to prove that there are serious questions about the evidence against you. In the court of public opinion, reasonable doubt is often enough. He leaned forward, his voice becoming more intense. But more importantly, we don't just defend against the old accusations. We go on the offensive. We showcase your talent in ways that make it impossible for anyone to deny your abilities. We arrange private performances, we create recordings, and we build a new reputation that's so strong it overshadows the old controversy. Victoria was quiet for a long time, thinking about what David was proposing. Part of her was excited by the possibility of reclaiming her life and her career, but another part of her was terrified of opening herself up to that kind of pain again. Why should I trust you? She finally asked. 6 hours ago, you were treating me like dirt. You were making me play piano to entertain your guests. How do I know this isn't just another way for you to use me for your own purposes? David nodded, acknowledging the fairness of her question. You're right to be suspicious. I haven't given you any reason to trust me. But I'm hoping that what I'm about to offer will show you that I'm serious about this. What are you offering? Complete partnership, David said. If you agree to let me help you, I'll provide all the money needed for investigators, lawyers, and publicity. I'll use all my connections in the business world to open doors for you. And I'll do it all without asking for anything in return except the chance to see justice done. Victoria raised an eyebrow. Nothing in return? I find that hard to believe. You're a businessman? You don't do anything without expecting a profit, David smiled. You're right. I do expect something in return, but it's not money. What I want is the satisfaction of knowing that I helped right a terrible wrong. And maybe, if we succeed, the chance to see you perform on the world's greatest stages. He paused, then added, more quietly, and maybe the chance to prove to myself that I can be a better person than I've been. Victoria studied his face, trying to determine if he was being sincere. She had become an expert at reading people during her 2 years of hiding, and something in David's expression told her that he meant what he was saying. This is insane, she said finally. The whole idea is completely crazy. Maybe, David agreed. But sometimes crazy ideas are the only ones that work. Victoria stood up and walked back to the window, looking out at the dark night. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass, and for a moment, she tried to imagine what her life could be like if David's plan actually worked. Could she really go back to being Victoria Moreau? Could she really reclaim her career and her identity? If I agree to this, she said without turning around, what would be the first step? We start by documenting everything, David replied. We write down every detail you remember about the original incident. We make a list of everyone involved, everyone who might have information, and everyone who might be willing to help us. And then we begin investigating. Victoria turned back, toward him. And what if someone recognizes me before we're ready? What if the story comes out before we can control it? Then we deal with it, David said simply. But Victoria, the story is going to come out anyway. After tonight, after what Robert Chun and the others witnessed, people are going to start asking questions. We can either let other people tell your story for you, or we can tell it ourselves. Victoria felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, trying to decide whether to jump. On one side was the safe, quiet life she had built for herself. On the other side was the possibility of reclaiming everything she had lost, but also the risk of losing everything she had left. I need time to think about this, she said finally. David nodded. Of course. This is a big decision, and you shouldn't rush it. But Victoria, don't take too long. Every day that passes is another day that Jonathan Blake gets to enjoy the success. And it should have been yours. As Victoria walked toward the kitchen door, heading back to her small room, David called after her. Victoria, for what it's worth, I believe you. I believe your story, and I believe in your talent. And I think it's time the world got a chance to believe in them too. Victoria spent 3 sleepless nights thinking about David's offer. She would lie awake in her small room, staring at the ceiling, weighing the risks against the possibilities. Every time she closed her eyes, she could hear the sound of the piano from that Friday night, and she could feel the rush of being herself again, even if it was just for a few minutes. On Monday morning, she found David in his home office, working at his computer. He looked up when she knocked on the doorframe. I'll do it, she said simply. David's face broke into a smile, the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him. You won't regret this, Victoria, I promise. I hope you're right, she replied, though her stomach was still twisted with anxiety within. A week, David had transformed his approach to Victoria's situation with the same intensity he brought to his business deals. He hired 3 different private investigation firms, each working on a different aspect of the case. He also brought in a legal team that specialized in reputation management and a publicity firm that had experience with high-profile comeback stories. The first breakthrough came from an investigator named Patricia Walsh, a former FBI agent who specialized in digital forensics. She had been analyzing the audio recordings that had supposedly proved Victoria's plagiarism, and she found something that made David's phone ring at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. David, you need to hear this, Patricia said when he answered. I've been examining the audio files that were used to frame Victoria, and I found something very interesting. What did you find? David asked, putting the call on speaker so Victoria could hear. The recordings have been digitally altered, Patricia explained. Whoever did this was skilled, but they weren't perfect. I found tiny inconsistencies in the audio signature that proved the files were edited. More importantly, I found metadata embedded in the files that shows exactly when and where they were modified. Victoria felt her heart racing. Does that mean you can prove I was framed? It's a start, Patricia said. But we need more. The metadata tells us when the files were changed, but it doesn't tell us who changed them. However, I have an idea about how we might find that out. Patricia's idea led to the second breakthrough. She had traced the digital fingerprints of the audio editing software back to a computer that had been registered to a small recording studio in downtown Chicago. When David's legal team contacted the studio owner, they discovered something that made Victoria's hands shake when she heard about it. The studio owner kept detailed records, David told Victoria as they sat in his office, surrounded by folders of evidence. And according to his files, Jonathan Blake rented studio time and editing equipment on 3 different occasions, right around the time you were framed. That's still not enough to prove he did it, Victoria said, though she felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in years. No, but it's enough to create reasonable doubt, David replied. And we're just getting started. The third breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Robert Chen, the music critic who had been so moved by Victoria's performance, had been doing some investigating of his own. He called David on a Thursday afternoon with news that changed everything. I've been asking around about Victoria Moreau, Robert said, and I found someone who knew her back when she was performing. Her name is Dr. Catherine Williams, and she was Victoria's professor at the conservatory. Victoria gasped when she heard her mentor's name. Professor Williams had been like a father to her, and his public rejection had been one of the most painful parts of her downfall. Professor Williams wants to talk, Robert continued. She says she has information that might help clear Victoria's name, information she was never able to share publicly before. 2 days later, Victoria found herself sitting in a coffee shop across from the woman who had taught her everything she knew about music. Professor Williams was older than Victoria remembered, with more gray in her hair and new lines around her eyes, but her smile was just as warm as it had always been. Victoria, she said, reaching across the table to squeeze her hands, I'm so sorry for what happened to you. I'm sorry for what I had to do. I understand why you couldn't support me publicly, Victoria said, though the old pain was still there. You had to protect yourself and the school. Professor Williams shook her head. That's not entirely true. I should have fought harder for you. I should have found a way to help, and I've regretted it every day since. She reached into her purse and pulled out a thick folder, but I never stopped believing in your innocence. And I never stopped collecting evidence that might someday help clear your name. Victoria stared at the folder. What kind of evidence? Everything, Professor Williams said. I kept copies of all your original compositions, including the piece that Jonathan Blake claimed you stole. I kept records of your practice sessions, your progress reports, and testimonials from other students who witnessed your creative process. I even kept security camera footage from the conservatory that shows you working on that composition months before Jonathan Blake claimed you plagiarized it. Victoria felt tears welling up in her eyes. You kept all of that for 3 years? I knew that someday the truth would come out, Professor Williams said, and I wanted to be ready to help when that day came. But the most important breakthrough came from Victoria herself. As she worked with David's team to piece together the timeline of her downfall, she remembered something that had seemed unimportant at the time but now appeared crucial. There was a woman, Victoria told David as they reviewed the evidence for the 100th time. She worked at the building where I used to live. Her name was Linda, and she was always very friendly to me. But after the scandal broke, she seemed nervous whenever she saw me. What did she seem nervous about? David asked. I don't know. But she kept apologizing for something, and she would never look me in the eye. At the time, I thought she was just uncomfortable because of the accusations against me. But now I'm wondering if there was more to it. David's investigators tracked down Linda Martinez, who had worked as a maintenance supervisor at Victoria's old apartment building. When they approached her, she broke down and confessed to something that had been weighing on her conscience for 3 years. Jonathan Blake offered me $5,000 to give him a key to Victoria's apartment, Linda admitted to the investigators. He said he was planning a surprise party for her and he needed to get in to set up decorations. I believed him. I had no idea he was planning to hurt her. With Linda's confession, Patricia's digital evidence, Professor Williams' documentation, and the studio records, David's team had built a case that completely dismantled the accusations against Victoria. But David wasn't satisfied with just proving her innocence. He wanted to restore her reputation in a way that would be impossible to ignore. We're going to arrange a series of private performances, he told Victoria as they planned the next phase of their campaign. Small, exclusive concerts for influential people in the music world. We'll invite critics, venue managers, recording executives, and other musicians. And we're going to let your talent speak for itself. The first private performance was held in David's own mansion in the same room where Victoria had played for his dinner party guests. This time, though, the audience was different. Robert Chung was there, along with the director of the city's symphony orchestra, two prominent music critics, and a recording executive who had worked with some of the biggest names in classical music. Victoria was nervous as she sat down at the piano, but as soon as her fingers touched the keys, all her fears disappeared. She played 3 pieces that night: the Rachmaninoff concerto that had started everything, one of her own original compositions from before the scandal, and a new piece she had written during her years in hiding. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The symphony director offered her a contract on the spot. The recording executive wanted to discuss a new album, and the music critics were already planning articles about her comeback. But the most meaningful response came from a surprise guest. Professor Williams had invited Dr. Elena Vasquez, the pianist whose work Jonathan Blake had claimed Victoria had plagiarized. Dr. Vasquez had flown in from New York specifically to hear Victoria play. "I want you to know," Dr. Vasquez told Victoria, after her performance, "that I never believed you had stolen my work. The piece they claimed you copied was so different from your style, so unlike anything you had ever written. I tried to say that publicly at the time, but nobody wanted to hear it." She paused, then continued, "But tonight, listening to you play your original composition, I can hear the same musical voice that created all your early works. There's no question in my mind that you are the true author of everything you've ever claimed to write." As word of Victoria's private performances spread through the classical music world, something remarkable began to happen. Other musicians, who had been forced to distance themselves from her during the scandal, started reaching out. Venues that had banned her began expressing interest in booking her, and music critics who had written harsh articles about her began publishing retractions and apologies. The final piece of the redemption puzzle came when Jonathan Blake himself made a fatal mistake. Feeling threatened by Victoria's comeback, he tried to plant new false evidence against her. 6 months after that life-changing dinner party, Victoria stood in her dressing room at Carnegie Hall, staring at herself in the mirror. She was wearing a beautiful black concert dress that David had insisted on buying for her, and her hair was styled in an elegant updo that made her look like the professional musician she had always been meant to be, but it wasn't the fancy dress or the perfect makeup that made her look different. It was the light in her eyes, the confidence in her posture, and the peace on her face. For the first time in 3 years, Victoria Moreau looked like herself again. There was a gentle knock on her dressing room door. "Come in," she called. David entered, looking nervous in a way she had never seen before. He was wearing his best suit and holding a small bouquet of white roses. "How are you feeling?" he asked, offering her the flowers. "Terrified," Victoria admitted with a smile. "But also excited. I never thought I'd be back here again." "You belong here," David said firmly. "You've always belonged here." Victoria looked at the man who had changed her life so completely. In the past 6 months, David had become more than just her benefactor or her friend. He had become the person who believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself, who fought for her when she was too tired to fight, and who never gave up on her even when the odds seemed impossible. "I owe you everything," she said quietly. David shook his head. "You don't owe me anything. You did all the hard work. I just helped clear the path." Another knock interrupted them. This time it was Robert Chun, the music critic who had started Victoria's journey back to the stage. "Victoria," he said, his eyes bright with excitement, "the hall is completely sold out. Every seat is filled, and there are reporters from every major music publication in the country. The whole classical music world is here tonight." Victoria felt her stomach flutter with nerves. "No pressure, right?" Robert laughed. "You're going to be magnificent. I've heard you play this piece a dozen times in rehearsal, and it gets more beautiful every time." As Robert left to take his seat, Victoria walked to the small window in her dressing room that looked out over the stage. She could see the famous Carnegie Hall auditorium filling up with people. The sight took her breath away. She spotted Professor Williams in the front row, beaming with pride. Next to her sat Dr. Elena Vasquez, the composer whose work Jonathan Blake had falsely claimed Victoria had stolen. In the third row, she could see Linda Martinez, the building supervisor whose confession had helped expose Jonathan's scheme. Linda had tears in her eyes already, even though the concert hadn't started yet. But the sight that moved Victoria most was seeing all the people who had doubted her, who had turned their backs on her, now sitting in the audience waiting to hear her play. Some of them looked ashamed, others looked curious, but they were all there, ready to listen with open minds and hearts. "Ladies and gentlemen," came the announcement over the loudspeaker, "please welcome back to Carnegie Hall, Victoria Moreau." Victoria took a deep breath, walked out of her dressing room, and headed toward the stage. As she walked down the long hallway, she thought about everything that had brought her to this moment. The years of practice as a child, her mother's sacrifices, her rise to fame, her devastating fall, her years in hiding, and her slow climb back to respectability. When she stepped onto the stage, the applause was immediate and thunderous. The entire audience rose to their feet, clapping and cheering before she had even played a single note. Victoria stood there for a moment, overwhelmed by the warmth and support flowing toward her from the crowd. She could see David in the front row, clapping harder than anyone else, his face glowing with pride and joy. Next to him sat Patricia Walsh, the investigator who had uncovered the truth about the doctored audio files. In the balcony, she spotted members of the legal team who had worked tirelessly to clear her name, but as Victoria looked out at the faces in the audience, she realized that this moment wasn't just about her comeback. It was about something much bigger. It was about the power of truth to overcome lies, the strength of talent to survive betrayal, and the importance of having people who believe in you when you can't believe in yourself. Victoria walked to the piano and sat down at the bench. The audience gradually quieted down, but she could still feel their energy and anticipation. She placed her hands on the keys and closed her eyes for a moment, just like she had done in David's mansion 6 months earlier, but this time there was no fear, no hesitation, and no shame. There was only music. She began to play the same Rachmaninoff concerto that had changed everything, but tonight it sounded different. Tonight it sounded like a celebration, like a declaration of victory, like a promise that the truth will always find a way to shine through the darkness. As the music filled Carnegie Hall, Victoria felt like she was floating. Every note was perfect. Every phrase was filled with emotion, and every moment was exactly as it was meant to be. She wasn't just playing the piano. She was telling her story through music, sharing her pain and her triumph with everyone who was listening. The orchestra behind her followed her lead flawlessly, responding to every subtle change in tempo and dynamics. The conductor, who had worked with the greatest musicians in the world, later said that Victoria's performance that night was one of the most moving he had ever experienced. In the audience, people were crying openly, not because they were sad, but because they were witnessing something truly extraordinary. They were seeing an artist who had been broken and rebuilt, who had lost everything and found her way back, who had been silenced and was now singing louder than ever. When Victoria played the final notes of the concerto, the silence that followed was even more powerful than the applause that had greeted her entrance. For a few seconds, the entire hall held its breath, absorbing the beauty of what they had just experienced. Then the applause erupted like thunder. People jumped to their feet, shouting, "Bravo!" and clapping until their hands hurt. The ovation went on for nearly 10 minutes, with Victoria taking bow after bow as flowers were thrown onto the stage. But the most meaningful moment came when the applause finally died down and Victoria stepped up to the microphone that had been placed at the front of the stage. 3 years ago, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall, I lost everything I thought mattered to me. My career, my reputation, and my identity were all taken away by someone who wanted to destroy me. The audience listened in complete silence. But tonight I realized that I didn't really lose everything, Victoria continued. I lost the things that other people gave me, but I never lost the things that truly belonged to me. I never lost my love for music. I never lost my ability to create beauty. And I never lost hope that someday the truth would set me free." She paused, looking out at the faces in the audience. "I want to thank everyone who helped me find my way back to this stage. But most of all, I want to thank the person who saw something in me when I couldn't see it in myself, who believed in me when I had given up believing, and who reminded me that sometimes the best way to win is to stop hiding and start fighting." Victoria looked directly at David, who was wiping tears from his eyes. "Thank you for giving me back my life," she said. The audience erupted in applause again, but Victoria held up her hand for silence. "I have one more piece I'd like to play for you tonight," she said. "It's something I wrote during my years away from music, and I've never performed it publicly before. I call it Coming Home." Victoria returned to the piano and began to play her new composition. It was unlike anything she had ever written before. It started quietly and sadly, reflecting the pain and loneliness of her years in hiding. But gradually it built into something triumphant and joyful, representing her journey back to herself and back to the music she loved. As she played, Victoria thought about her mother, who had sacrificed so much to give her daughter the gift of music. She thought about Professor Williams, who had never stopped believing in her innocence. She thought about all the people who had helped her find her way back to this moment. But mostly, she thought about David, who had seen past the gray uniform and the quiet demeanor to the artist underneath, who had taken a risk on someone everyone else had written off, who had taught her that sometimes the most unlikely people can become your greatest allies. When the concert ended and Victoria finally left the stage, she found David waiting for her in the wings. Without saying a word, he wrapped her in a hug that said everything they both felt. "So," he said when they finally pulled apart, "what's next for the famous Victoria Moreau?" Victoria laughed, feeling lighter and happier than she had in years. "I don't know," she said. "But whatever it is, I'm not going to face it alone." As they walked back toward her dressing room together, Victoria realized that her story had come full circle. She had started as a young woman with a dream, become a star, lost everything, and found her way back to where she belonged. But more than that, she had learned that talent alone isn't enough to survive in this world. You also need courage, persistence, and people who care enough to fight for you when you can't fight for yourself. The girl who had once played piano in a tiny apartment while her mother worked 2 jobs had finally made it home. David Rodriguez had always believed he was destined for greatness. At 24, he was already performing in some of the most beautiful concert halls across Europe. His fingers moved across piano keys like magic, creating sounds that made audiences hold their breath in wonder. But somewhere along the way, success had changed him. He wasn't the same humble boy who had started playing piano at age 5 in his grandmother's small apartment. Back then, music was pure joy for him. He would spend hours at the old upright piano, completely lost in the melodies he created. His grandmother would sit nearby, knitting and smiling as she listened to her grandson pour his heart into the music. Those days felt like a lifetime ago. Now, David lived in a world of expensive suits, 5-star hotels, and constant praise. Everyone around him told him he was exceptional, that he was a gift to the classical music world. Slowly, these words had inflated his ego until he began to believe he was better than everyone else. The concert halls where he performed were always packed. People would travel from different cities just to hear him play. Music critics wrote glowing reviews calling him a technical master and the future of classical piano. With each standing ovation, with each perfect review, David's sense of superiority grew stronger. He had developed a habit of looking down on other musicians. During rehearsals, he would roll his eyes when other performers made mistakes. He would make cutting remarks about their technique, their interpretation, their lack of natural talent. The orchestra members had learned to stay away from him during breaks. They found him cold and arrogant. David's manager, Robert, had tried to talk to him about his attitude several times. "You're incredibly talented," Robert would say, "but talent alone isn't everything. People are starting to talk about your behavior." David would just shrug these conversations off. In his mind, jealousy was natural when you were as gifted as Tonight was different, though. Tonight, he wasn't performing at his usual venues filled with wealthy classical music lovers. Instead, he was at a charity event for the National Foundation for the Blind. The venue was elegant enough. A beautiful historic theater with red velvet seats and golden decorations on the walls. But David felt this was beneath him. He had only agreed to perform because his publicist insisted it would be good for his image. "It shows your charitable side," she had explained. "The media will love it." David didn't care about charity or helping others. He just wanted to get through the evening and collect his fee. As he warmed up backstage, David could hear the audience gathering in the theater. The sound was different from his usual concerts. Instead of the sophisticated murmur of his typical audience, he heard a mix of voices, some older, some younger, some speaking in different languages. Many were being guided to their seats by volunteers or family members. "This is ridiculous," David muttered to himself as he adjusted his bow tie in the mirror. "I'm performing Rachmaninoff for people who can't even see my technique. What's the point?" A young volunteer knocked on his dressing room door. "Mr. Rodriguez? We're ready for your sound check." David walked onto the stage and looked out at the partially filled theater. Many of the audience members were already in their seats, and he noticed something that made him uncomfortable. A significant number of them had white canes beside their chairs or guide dogs lying quietly at their feet. Some were wearing dark glasses even though they were indoors. "I can't believe I'm wasting my talent on this crowd," he thought to himself, as he sat at the grand piano. It was a beautiful instrument, a Steinway concert grand that had been donated specifically for the event. Under normal circumstances, David would have been excited to play such a magnificent piano. Tonight it just felt like pearls before swine. During the sound check, David played a few scales and arpeggios. His technique was flawless as always, his fingers flying across the keys with precision, but his heart wasn't in it. He was already thinking about the expensive restaurant where he planned to have dinner after the show. The event coordinator, a cheerful woman in her 50s, approached the stage. "Mr. Rodriguez, thank you so much for being here tonight. This means the world to our community." David gave her a polite but cold smile. "Of course, when do I perform?" "You're our featured artist, so you'll close the show. We have a few other performers first, some of our students from the music program." David's eyebrows shot up. "Students? You mean amateur performers?" "Well, they're learning, but some of them are quite talented. Music is incredibly important to the blind community. Many of our members have developed extraordinary musical abilities." David almost laughed out loud. "I'm sure they have," he said, with barely concealed sarcasm. As the evening began, David watched from the wings as various performers took the stage. There was an elderly man who played violin, his fingers finding each note by touch and memory. A teenage boy sang an operatic piece with surprising vocal control. A middle-aged woman played flute with gentle, flowing phrases. To David, it all sounded amateur. Sure, they were competent, but they lacked the technical perfection he had spent years developing. They played with feeling, but feeling without technique was worthless in his opinion. He checked his watch repeatedly, waiting for his turn to show everyone what real music sounded like. The audience seemed to enjoy these performances, clapping enthusiastically after each piece. David found their appreciation annoying. "They're applauding mediocrity," he thought. "They wouldn't know real talent if it hit them in the face." During intermission, David overheard conversations in the lobby. People were discussing the music with genuine passion and knowledge. One older gentleman was explaining to his companion the subtle differences between various interpretations of a Beethoven sonata. A young woman was describing how music helped her navigate the world in ways that sight never could, despite himself. David was surprised by their sophisticated understanding of music, but he quickly pushed these thoughts away. Book knowledge doesn't equal real ability, he told himself. As the second half of the program began, David prepared for his performance. He had chosen to play Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, one of the most technically demanding pieces in the classical repertoire. It was a piece that showcased every aspect of his technical abilities: speed, power, delicacy, and complex musical architecture, he knew this piece would be impossible for any of the amateur performers he had watched earlier. It required years of intensive training, perfect finger independence, and an understanding of musical structure that only came from formal conservatory education. Standing in the wings, adjusting his cufflinks one final time, David felt confident. Soon, everyone in this theater would understand the difference between real artistry and the well-meaning but limited attempts they had been hearing all evening. He had no idea that his entire worldview was about to be shattered by what would happen next. The evening was about to take a turn that would change not just his opinion of others, but his understanding of what music really meant.